Today I will be talking about a lens that is quite unique and has climbed up high in my wish list in the short time that I have used it. It's Canon's RF 200-800 f6.3 to f9. A telephoto-zoom lens that is quite unique and unlike anything else from any other manufacturer, which is bound to impress many. And we'll take a closer look at it today. I'm David, you are watching DAVISION in English, and let's go. A while back, for the occasion when the 200mm of my RF 70-200 wasn't enough, I picked up a used Canon EF 100-400 IS USM 2 with the 1.4 converter version 3. And I must say this combo hasn't disappointed me at all. I got it for around 1,000 euros used, which was a great deal. And I have taken some of my favorite shots with it, like this one here with surfers on Fuerteventura back in January. But even at 560mm focal length with the converter, it was often insufficient for my wildlife attempts. For me, wildlife mainly means trying to photograph birds. And zooming with your feet isn't always an option there. And the lack of focal length was especially frustrating in this case here. I was feeding ducks with my son, even had my camera with the 100-400 with me, and then suddenly he was there, the kingfisher, right in front of us, posing in beautiful spots for photos. First on a stone, then on a bush, and finally on a branch from which he dove into the water to fish. Really, really nice. Even if I'm relatively satisfied with my first lucky kingfisher shots, I still wished they could have turned out better. At this distance, 400mm was unfortunately far too short, and even 560 with the converter probably wouldn't have been enough. So I quickly asked Canon if I could test their RF 200-800 and waited in the same spot again a few days later the next week for 3 days in a row. After all, focal length can often only be matched by even more focal length. And the Canon 200-800 remains unmatched in focal length for full frame zoom lens. But as expected, the kingfisher only made a few flybys once I had the right gear with me. They must be able to sense that when you come prepared. And every time you have only your phone, they fly back and forth, happily pose for you, but you don't have your camera with you. So you will have to be satisfied with photos of ducks, coots, robins, blue tits and blackbirds in this video, unfortunately. The RF 200-800 isn't an L series lens, but it has many of the L series features. For starters, it's big, wide and huge, which makes it a strong impression at first glance. Priced at 2,500 euros, it's quite reasonable for an RF lens. Comparisons are tricky since this lens is so unique, but it resembles Sony's 200-600 in size, which is about 1,000 euros cheaper and has been around for a few years. Both are 32 centimeters long, over 10 centimeters in diameter, but the Sony is a little bit larger, and both weigh just over 2 kilos and are quite hefty. The 95mm filter thread is another clue for the size of this lens. I had to reorganize my backpack since it wasn't fit in there with the divider in the middle. And so how often you will carry this lens with you when you need it is a crucial consideration in buying such lenses. The main difference, however, is that Sony's similarly large and heavy lens comes with f5.6 to f6.3 aperture. So it's significantly faster than the Canon one. It stops where the Canon lens starts at 200mm. But Canon's lens offers 800mm at the top end, through only at f9 unfortunately. Sony's 200-600 with the 1.4 teleconverter reaches 840mm also at f9. So you may have the necessary focal length, but if you want shutter speed suitable for birds in flight without any blurred wings, the ISO often shoots above 10,000, unless the sun is blazingly shining. The lens has a pleasant zoom ring that can be switched between smooth and tight, but no separate manual focus ring. Only a control ring that can be used as one. There's an AF control MF switch for selecting what it should do, and the stabilizer can be turned off. Though there are no separate stabilizer modes on this lens like on other telephoto lenses. You can program the button on the lens in the body, for example for subject detection switching. The lens's build quality is excellent. It's indistinguishable from Canon's L series lenses and also has a rubber seal at the mount and a dust and splash resistant design. Really, really nice to see. It also has a nano USM motor, which is entirely silent. The stand foot isn't removable here, that's a bummer, and unfortunately also lacks Arca Swiss grooves on the sides, which I really like from Sigma or Tamron lenses, for example. With 17 elements and 11 groups, it's not particularly complex for such an intense telephoto zoom lens, and it has 9 rounded aperture plates. What's interesting here is that with 80 centimeters minimum focal distance at 200 mm, it's excellent for a telephoto zoom lens and offers a 1:4 magnification ratio. It's far above the competition. For example, Sony's lens only focuses from 2.4 meters away. After all that talk, let's look to the results. There's absolutely nothing to criticize in terms of sharpness with this lens. I've done some comparison shots between my EF 100-400 with the converter and the 200-800, and honestly, I can't see any difference in sharpness. Expect that the older EF-L lens produces a warmer out of camera image. Sharpness is consistent even at wide open apertures across all focal lengths, with no visible sharpness fall off at the edges or corners. It even holds up well against the 100-400 with a converter, which again highlights how great the EF 100-400 IS USM version 2 still is. It's small, it's light, it's affordable and good. But let's stay focused on the RF 200-800, even if I still love that EF 100-400 version 2. As I said, no issues with sharpness at any focal length in any image visible. Chromatic aberrations are also very well controlled. I didn't find any colorful contrast edges in my shots, or also no issues in the foreground or background blur, which I found impressive. Even not when there are water splashes in the image, which usually tend to be a pretty strong point for these chromatic aberrations. But due to the relatively narrow aperture and the telephoto range, this isn't that surprising. Telephoto lenses are generally less prone to such issues due to the lenses used in the lens for the magnification instead of the wider angle from other lenses. But one issue is the bokeh. With aperture of f6.3 to f9, this lens doesn't produce the world's most beautiful bokeh. Separation is not a strong point here. In my test setup, double rings in the bokeh balls were noticeable, but the EF 100-400 also has them. Up to 500 mm, the bokeh is smooth and clean, but deteriorates at 600 and 800 mm, becoming somewhat frayed at the edges and not looking so nice. In practice, this lens produces too little separation for my taste, as I like to completely blur the background of my subjects. Of course, if the background is farther away from the subject, yes, you can still isolate it very well, but in wildlife you rarely get to choose. I didn't like how smaller highlights looked in the background. Like when the light reflects from a water droplet like here, they appeared messy for my taste. Still, for this lens's category, it's perfectly acceptable. An RF 100-500 does better here, but it's also more expensive and lacks the 800 mm reach. Nice thing of this lens, there's almost no distortion. Each focal length has slight pincushion distortion without the profile corrections, though it's barely even noticeable. Vignetting is present at the corners at each focal length, especially at 200 mm. Given that such lenses often emphasize separation, I don't mind a little vignetting, but keep in mind with the high ISOs you are probably using, because the aperture is so slow, this could lead to stronger noise in the corners when the correction profiles are used, since they are pushed in post, and that leads to higher noise. To save space in my backpack, I tested this lens without any lens hood, and I didn't encounter any issues with backlight or with strong flares. Naturally, you wouldn't point an 800 mm lens directly at the sun, but even in bright daylights, no flares or big contrast loss appeared. However, you should be cautious because telephoto lenses can show a drop in contrast when light hits the lenses from the side. Here with this lens, I was highly impressed by the autofocus. I had some bad experiences with long telephoto lenses, especially with Sigma EF glass on RF cameras. But Canon here, that's totally different. Canon uses a good nano USM motor here, resulting in almost silent and fast autofocus that also handles birds in flight very, very well. Switching focus from near to far is quick and accurate, and working on the R5 Mark II was very pleasant with this lens. However, even my adapted EF 100-400 version 2 is flawless on the R5 Mark II in terms of autofocus. And while I didn't specifically test the stabilizer's compensation performance, it performed well in practice. When I half pressed the shutter, the image stabilized well even at 800mm handheld. Though it's a shame that there's no mode switching for panning. And as a YouTuber, I'm naturally also drawn to video features, especially since an 8K camera with a 200-800 lens can produce quite unique footage. With 800mm and 2x crop, you are still delivering 4K full resolution, then at effectively 1600mm of focal length. In the end, this is an all-around compelling telephoto-zoom lens with two initial but obvious drawbacks you see from the beginning. It's quite large and weighs over 2 kilos and isn't that fast in terms of aperture. But there's really nothing to compare on the market. No other full-frame zoom lens goes to 800mm. So Canon created a highly intriguing RF system lens. 2,500 euros is a lot of money, but focal length can only be replaced by more focal length. A 100-500 is significantly smaller, but also with a 1.4 converter, it would be slower and max out at 700mm, not 800. And of course, you could still attach a teleconverter to the 200-800, reaching f12 at 1120mm. And I hope you are fine then with ISO 51200. While the lens is on my wish list, yes, I'm still sticking to my EF 100-400 IS USM for now because I valued the brightness a lot. So let me know which RF mount telephoto zoom lens is the most interesting for you. Feel free to comment down below as always. And you will find links to the RF 200-800 in the video description down below, and shopping through these links supports the channel at no extra cost to you, allowing me to continue making such videos like this one here you watched right now. Remember to like, subscribe and hit the bell if you haven't already. And here are 2 more videos you can check out next. And I would like to say, see you next time.